Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We had a very robust discussion today in the caucus about a variety of issues of concern in terms of our For the People agenda and how we're going to move forward. Connection, of course, with the USMCA, with the continuing resolution to make sure that we keep government open while the Senate tries to get its act together and do its job, as well as pending legislation that will be on the floor this week that our Vice Chair will discuss. We as House Democrats remain committed to our For the People agenda. We're very clear in terms of our sense of purpose as to why we are here, to fight for the people, for working families, middle-class folks, senior citizens, the poor, the sick, and the afflicted, the least, the lost, and the left behind. And in that regard, of course, we're going to continue to focus on lowering health care costs with a focus on protecting people with pre-existing conditions, driving down the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs. It's outrageous that America pays more for medication and for prescription drugs than any other developed nation in the world. No justification that has any rational basis for that other than the greed of some in this nation and the anti-competitive behavior of Big Pharma. And of course, we're going to deal with the issue of surprise billing and deal with it in a bipartisan way, all wrapped around our agenda of lowering health care costs for everyday Americans. We also continue to demand that the Senate act to protect the American people from the gun violence epidemic that is ravaging our nation. More than 200 days have passed since H.R. 8 was voted on a bipartisan basis in the House of Representatives. Universal criminal background check legislation has overwhelming support amongst the American people, including amongst Republicans, independents, and gun owners. What is the problem, Mitch? Do your job. Americans are dying. We can act and have a responsibility to do so to address the gun violence epidemic. We are not going to let the do-nothing Senate off the hook. Let me now yield for an update on legislation that will be moving this week in connection with our effort on behalf of everyday Americans to our dynamic Vice Chair, Catherine Clark.
Thank you so much, Hakeem. This week, House Democrats are continuing to work for consumers, for workers, and for the people of this country by passing the FAIR Act. The FAIR Act is something simple, yet very critical to leveling the playing field in this country. It prevents companies from forcing individuals to give up their right to pursue legal action by forcing them into arbitration. At its core, forced arbitration is designed to protect big business and corporate leaders from accountability. Banks, credit card companies, payday lenders, you name it. They shouldn't have the upper hand over American workers. And when you open a bank account or buy a cell phone or work in an office, you shouldn't be forced to sign away your rights. Particularly, I have seen cases back at home where survivors of sexual assault have no remedy in their workplace because they have signed away their rights in a pre-dispute arbitration agreement. This bill is about evening that playing field for Americans. And while we continue to proactively work and fight for American families, House Democrats and Americans, as the chairman pointed out, are waiting for the Senate to act. We have passed over 250 bills, 50 of those major pieces of substantive legislation. But there is none more important right now than those bills pertaining to gun violence. 203 days without any action in the Senate. The American people are behind universal background checks. We know it can save lives, and there is no excuse for Mitch McConnell and his enablers not to take up this legislation. So with that, I will turn it back to the chairman, and we look forward to your questions.
Good morning. Thank you.
Morning.
What are the political consequences? Let's say if the Senate doesn't move on anything, and maybe there can't be any agreement between the House, the Senate, and the President on this. Your side has pretty much run the table in suburban and urban districts. We know that it's a different question in the Senate. But what is the political consequence from your vantage point if they don't do anything, considering the idea that you guys have most of these seats in urban and suburban districts? There's not that much more out there for you to get in that sense.
Well, this is not about political consequences. This is about the livelihood, safety, and well-being of the American people. The gun violence epidemic touches everyone. It touches Americans who are white, who are black, who are Latino, who are Asian, who are Native American, who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Christian, who are Hindu, who are Buddhist, who are believers, who are non-believers, who are gay, who are straight, who are young, who are old, who are women, who are men. It touches everybody. And so it seems to me that the Senate should be prepared to act in a responsible way on behalf of the American people. And the American people will ultimately decide what the consequences are in November of 2020 if they fail to do so.
Chairman, so question. It's unlikely that the Senate will actually take up H.R. 8, but allegedly they're working on a compromise with the White House. Would you back a weaker version of that legislation if it doesn't incorporate everything you want?
Well, let's see what the Senate comes up with. But it has to meaningfully address the gun violence epidemic, and H.R. 8 should be the foundation. Remember, we already have criminal background checks as a matter of law in this country that have saved lives, that has been in effect since the 90s. The problem is that gun show sales aren't covered, and that's a major loophole. And transactions over the internet are not covered, and that's a major loophole. So all we're trying to do is to close that loophole, and it seems to me that central to any legislation that moves forward out of the Senate, for it to secure support in the House, would certainly have to close those major loopholes to ensure that we're doing everything possible to keep guns out of the hands of criminals in this country. Catherine?
I'd just like to add on that. Before once the NRA has weighed in. So this is about a conversation about security in our communities. And we are not going to go away. We are going to keep the pressure up because we have communities in fear. We have people who think twice about going to a street bear in their hometown. I know my own children, when we had a movie film stop showing, they turned to me and asked if I thought there was a shooter in the theater. These are the kinds of fears that are becoming woven into the fabric of our lives. And we can't tolerate it. And we can't tolerate a Senate that won't have this discussion at all with the American people. And so we are going to keep the pressure on them to take these bills up, to work for the American people, to say no to the gun lobby and special interests, and work for security in our communities.
Hi, you mentioned that USMCA was discussed in the caucus, and I wanted to tie it into the drug prices. The 10-year exclusivity on biologics, from what I understand, the counterproposal from USTR is to keep it at 10 years, but to have wording that says if Congress changes it to 7 years or 5 years in the future, then the pact would automatically lower it to that number as well. Is that something that the caucus is receiving well, or are people saying, no, we're not satisfied? How would you characterize that?
Well, there are 4 issues that have been articulated, as you know, that are of concern to the caucus as it relates to our continuing effort to try to get to yes. And the Speaker reiterated that we are on a pathway to yes, but we aren't there yet. Of course, enforceability, labor standards, environmental standards, and the biologics issue. We don't want to do anything in connection with the USMCA that undermines what is a bipartisan effort to drive down the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs in this country. That counterproposal, as I understand it, is being evaluated now by the working group that Speaker Pelosi designated, being led ably by Chairman Richie Neal. And I would expect at some point that Chairman Neal will report to the caucus on the perspectives related to the biologics issue and the other issues that are being discussed, and then we can have a more clearer understanding as to where we're going to go as Democrats.
So if you weren't talking about the counterproposals in detail, what kind of discussion was there about USMCA this morning?
Well, several things. One, again, the Speaker reiterated that we are on a pathway toward yes, but we've made clear that there are those 4 issues that need to be addressed, because we simply are not going to sign off or rubber stamp NAFTA 2.0 that is not a meaningful improvement on the original version of NAFTA. That's not in the best interest of the American worker, just so that Donald Trump can run around the country and proclaim victory. We want a meaningful improvement, and we're working hard to get there on a pathway toward yes.
On guns again, you said Democrats would back anything that saves lives. Do you personally, and do you think Democrats would back either a voluntary or mandatory gun buyback? What's the conversation like on that?
Right. Well, there has been no conversation about that within the caucus or even on the Judiciary Committee. Chairman Nadler has indicated that at some point in the future, he expects to have a hearing on what we can potentially do with respect to assault weapons. These are weapons of war. They don't belong in the hands of individuals who will do harm to everyday Americans. They are not used to hunt deer. They are used to hunt human beings. And so we need to do something about it, but there's a variety of different proposals in terms of the pathway to go. No one has talked about gun buybacks in any formal way at this point.
Let me be clear about what I mean by that, is that we are viewing this as the public health crisis that it is, and that we have to look at it in a comprehensive way. And part of the starting of that was H.R. 8, which put forth universal background checks that included the internet gun shows and also certain private sales with exclusions for close family members. We think that is a great bill that should be taken up and made law in this country. And what we're finding is just this confounding situation where this bill and so many others are just piling up at the Senate door. And for how long should the American people be held hostage on this issue by Mitch McConnell, where we have such broad support by, over 90% of Americans across the political ideology? This is not a red or blue issue. This is about how we protect our communities. And that's what I mean by we are going to continue to work for how we address this public health crisis, whether we're looking at suicides, homicides, mass shootings. This is a interwoven, holistic approach that is needed to make sure that our communities and individuals are safe again.
Go to the second row.
Thanks. So some of your members are talking about inherent contempt for Corey Lewandowski. Is that something that leadership could support? Are you there personally? And where's leadership at?
Well, as I made clear at the hearing yesterday, Corey Lewandowski clearly didn't show up to tell the truth. He showed up to be part of a charade and a continuing cover-up. that said he couldn't run away from the central fact that was relevant to his presence yesterday, which is that Donald Trump summoned him to the White House on 2 occasions, June 19th, 2017, and July 19th, 2017. And on those occasions, beginning with that June meeting, directed him to tell the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, to order Sessions to tell the special counsel to limit the criminal investigation to alleged future instances of foreign interference, as if the Department of Justice has some time machine to investigate criminality. What they were doing, what the president directed Lewandowski to do, was to try to curtail a criminal investigation into the Trump campaign's activity the prior year in 2016. And as Bob Mueller laid out in his report, that's textbook obstruction of justice. Lewandowski couldn't run away from that fact. Now, he tried to bob and weave and dance, and he embarrassed himself yesterday, putting on a show for his puppet master who's sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But we will evaluate whether it's necessary to sanction him in some way in terms of the articulation of a phony privilege that has no basis in law, couldn't point to any Supreme Court jurisprudence, can't point to federal common law, can't point to the United States Constitution, can't point to federal statute, can't point to anything other than the fantasy that was made up to try to obstruct the committee's work. So Jerry Nadler, I'm sure, will evaluate the best way to move forward in that regard, and I look forward to being supportive of his efforts.
What do you think those ramifications should be?
Well, as I indicated, Jerry Nadler will evaluate the way in which we should move forward. I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee. I'll be speaking with him, I'm sure, in the context of how we think as a Judiciary Committee should proceed. And then ultimately there'll be a discussion with leadership, starting with Speaker Pelosi.
Diana Presley has filed a resolution asking for the Judiciary Committee to inquire into impeaching Justice Kavanaugh. I wondered if that was discussed today and whether you think that the committee should inquire into that.
Yeah, that was not discussed. I think Chairman Nadler has indicated that he has grave concerns with the work that the FBI failed to do in the context of the background investigation connected to Justice Kavanaugh when he was a nominee, after Jeff Flake withheld his vote so that there would be an additional week. It's not clear what was done. FBI Director Christopher Wray will be before us, I believe, in a few weeks, and that will be a moment where he'll have to answer some serious questions, and then we'll take it from there. Catherine, you want to? Sure.
So I think what we see in both of these cases, the previous question and yours, is sometimes we're getting lost in, are we in impeachment? Are we going to be moving for contempt? What are we doing? We're losing the actual thread and facts, which are beyond discouraging. What we have seen with Justice Kavanaugh is a sham process where the facts were rushed over and women's voices, again, weren't heard in this process. It feels like we didn't learn a lot from Anita Hill's experience decades ago. And what we are committed to doing is getting the facts to the American people. And that's what we saw yesterday with Mr. Lewandowski's testimony. Let's not lose sight of the fact that he testified. It doesn't matter if he tells the truth to the media. Let's not lose sight of the facts that he said that the president tried to help him obstruct the investigation. Those are the critical facts. That is what we are after. And the legal proceedings that we use are not nearly as important as how we get those facts out and hold this administration accountable.
Front row, did you still have a question? Oh, Heather.
So earlier this week, Chairman Adler said definitively he thinks President Trump should be impeached. Yesterday, after the hearing, he said he thought Lewandowski's performance and refusal to answer many of your questions added even more weight to that. Do you personally think that Democrats know enough to begin impeachment proceedings against Trump?
Well, we're at the beginning of the impeachment investigation that was just formally launched last week, and I think we need a robust series of hearings to present the information to the American people before any of that information can be acted upon one way or the other. As the Speaker has consistently said, we have a solemn obligation to follow the facts, apply the law, and be guided by the Constitution. And that is what we're going to continue to do. And the reality is, no one is disputing, including one of Trump's main sycophants, Corey Lewandowski, the central findings of the Mueller report. Russia interfered in our election in sweeping and systematic fashion. The Trump campaign welcomed that interference at the highest levels. Russia interfered with one objective, which was to artificially place Donald Trump at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Apparently, they were successful in that endeavor. And the notion, for instance, as Corey Lewandowski indicated yesterday, that there was no evidence of potential illegal coordination is another phony narrative. I think it was August 2nd when Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort met with Konstantin Kilimnik, a Russian spy, in New York. At that meeting, Manafort handed Kilimnik proprietary polling data for voters in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Subsequent to that meeting, malign Russian social media activity just happened to take place in those three states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which provided Trump with his Electoral College victory. And then, as Lewandowski indicated yesterday, Trump wants Sessions to constrain the special counsel's investigation as it relates to foreign interference, perhaps because he doesn't want instances like that to come to light before the American people. So we're going to continue to follow the facts, apply the law, be guided by the Constitution on this journey as it relates to obstruction of justice, abuse of power, the culture of corruption, and then we'll see where that takes us.
How should the president respond to the attack on the Saudi oil facilities? Is it an attack something you should be thinking about retaliation?
Well, military action should always be the last step that we take in a thoughtful process. And so initially, we need to get to the bottom of what actually occurred. And unfortunately, because of the 13,000 plus lies that President Trump has told since he was inaugurated, the burden is very high for him to persuade people throughout the world as to what actually happened. And then when you layer on top of the fact that the victim of this attack, Saudi Arabia, has its own credibility challenges, I would remind everyone, this is the same country that effectively butchered a Washington Post journalist with a bone saw and then lied about it. And so before we just take their word for what happened, or the Trump administration's word for what happened, let's all be given the chance to evaluate the facts as objectively as possible. And then hopefully, once the culprit is determined with some degree of accuracy, then we can figure out how to proceed diplomatically with sanctions or whatever is the appropriate response.
Are you going to get a briefing from
Well, that's a question that I think will ultimately be determined by Speaker Pelosi, but her preference has always been the more information that members of Congress receive, the better. Last question?
Do you think, we've heard you guys talk about the prescription drugs and trade and all these policy issues you guys are working on, but do you think that the impeachment message, that need to get the facts out on the investigations to the American public is overshadowing the policy work? And I know the tendency is to blame the media for that, but is there, beyond blaming the media,
I would never blame the media.
is there a way to rectify that, to get more of this out and communicated to the public?
Well, what members are continuing to do is to engage as intimately as possible with the people we're privileged to represent back at home. And that was something that was done in a very clear-throated way in the previous Congress, even though a lot of the popular discussion that came out of this town related to the then special counsel's investigation and the day-to-day developments. But the election in November of 2018 was about health care. And it was about health care because we made that a priority based on what we were hearing from the people we're privileged to represent in the context of the intimate interactions that we continue to have when we go back home. And as long as we continue to do that, then I think people will understand here in this country that we are working in their best interests on prescription drug pricing, on surprise billing, on protecting people with pre-existing conditions, on a real infrastructure plan that fixes our bridges, roads, tunnels, airports, and mass transportation system, and does it in a way that we think can create at least 16 million good-paying jobs, and on fixing our broken democratic process and dealing with the gun violence epidemic.
I just wanted to add to that. When we were home in August with constituents, and as we're about to go back in a week to work in our districts, that is where the work of the Democratic caucus, really where the rubber meets the road, in the town halls that they're having, hundreds of town halls over August, meeting with constituents, touring small businesses, listening to our farmers, listening in Massachusetts, what's happening to the lobster industry with this trade war with China. These are the sort of issues that matter to American families, what they talk about around their kitchen table, and that is what the members of our caucus are discussing with them. And yes, we are going to live up to our constitutional responsibility to hold oversight hearings, to investigate, to demand accountability, and to work to protect our democracy and the fundamental right to have a fair vote in 2020, free of foreign influence and free of voter suppression. But when we are home, our members are talking about those issues that really matter to families. How do they pay their bills and afford health care? How do they handle the rising costs of insulin with a diabetic child? How do they deal with pre-existing conditions? How do they make sure that they have broadband so they can run small businesses in rural parts of our country? How do we fund our schools? And as we look at this president and his power grab to build the wall, and who's paying for it? Not Mexico. Much of it's being paid for by our military families. These are the discussions that we're having, that when you take $13 million from the Andrews Air Force Base Child Care Center, where they routinely have sewage flow back up into the center, where the education for our military families is not what it should be. But there was a chance to get some relief until the president decided to take that money from our military readiness, from our military families, and use it to fund a wall. These are the issues that are important to families at homes. They're the ones we will continue to prioritize. It is why we won the midterms, and it is why we're going to win in 2020.
Yeah, we're going to make clear that House Democrats are going to continue to fight for working families, middle-class folks, and senior citizens. And the central distinction is that Republicans fight for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. And in November of 2020, the American people, we believe, will have a clear understanding of who's fighting for who. Thank you, everyone.